I was born in Berlin, Germany on June 25, 1932, prior to the rise of Hitler to the chancellorship. So I can call myself a pre-Hitler German. I was born in a local clinic and then brought home and grew up there under the care of my mother, while my father, who was a traveling salesman and then a sales manager for a German shoe firm, was traveling for business. I think it was 1938. We were ordered out, we were expelled from the apartment in which we lived because a new law had been passed relegating the German Jewish population out of these neighborhoods into somewhere else. It was not a ghetto in Berlin, but it was a less desirable area. Although all kinds of laws were being passed very shortly after Hitler came to power. He came to power in March. As early as April, the first anti-Jewish boycott was organized. A law was passed that complicated name, which in essence defined or separated Aryans, in quotation marks, from non-Aryans, and which were intent, of course, to create the so-called pure race. We were no longer citizens, and therefore we no longer had a state to call our own. We were stateless, we became stateless, and we also lost all our civic rights. You know, that's about the time when Jewish people began to think seriously about leaving. America was the welcoming port, and so that's where everybody wanted to go. And to the best of my knowledge, my parents applied for a visa, but it took a long time in the works, particularly because of the immigration laws that were passed in this country, I believe 1927, that limited the number of immigrants to about 20-odd thousand, and you just had to wait your turn. At the time that I started school, Jewish children were not allowed to go to public school. And so the Jewish community established, in essence, synagogal schools and like parochial schools. And so I started school the night of November 9 to 10, that there occurred this huge pogrom, which we now know as the Kristallnacht, the night of the broken glasses, when the Nazis desecrated all the synagogues in Germany and ransacked most Jewish-owned shops, invaded some homes, and on that day and the following days arrested something on the order of 30,000 Jewish men. Now, my father was not among those arrested at that time. He was arrested a few days later while he was on a business trip, sent first to Dachau and subsequently to Buchenwald. As for me, of course, school ended because the synagogue was burned and therefore everything ended. So I had barely gone to school a week or so when school ended. Apparently the news broke in the community that passage to Cuba was possible and that landing permits were available for purchase. You had to buy a landing permit. She managed to get the permits and also at the same time found out that a cruise liner, the St. Louis, had been chartered to take a load full of German and Austrian Jews to Cuba if they had the appropriate documents. But once the documents were available, my father was indeed released. So we went from Berlin to Hamburg, and my father was released and joined us in Hamburg. And we boarded the ship, and together with the other passengers, on May 13th of 1939. The mood, as I understood subsequently, was not very happy. However, after a week or so of sailing, as the ship entered warmer water toward Cuba, because the mood lightened little by little, and it was a very nice ship, and everything was great. You know, people had the usual things, sunning on the decks as it got warmer. A pool was open. So the cruise to Cuba was very nice, and people began to relax and to be hopeful about their future, because virtually all of them considered that their stay in Cuba was going to be just short, transitory, while they waited for their quota number to come up. But then, big bad news. The ship was not allowed to dock, and no one was allowed to disembark or to come aboard. So that turned out that, of course, was very frightening to everybody. We could see that we were there in the bay, and we could see the Havana, but we could not disembark. Maybe hours after this all happened, and it became known that we would not be allowed to disembark because allegedly the landing permits were not being recognized by the government, that they had been sold illegally and so on and so forth. There were reasons given why we were not be admitted. Although I think 21 or 23 of the passengers on board actually did have legal visas and they were able to get off. And so as time was passing, of course, the anxiety was increasing, and the captain named a board of advisors to serve as go-betweens the passengers and himself. The captain was very worried. He knew what would happen if we all had to go back to Germany, and he vowed he would not take us back. This thing that was happening attracted world attention, and the news were being diffused around the globe by radio and movie tone, and newspapers and magazines. And so they sent a representative to try to negotiate with the Cuban government. Eventually, it was arranged that we would be able to disembark if the joint could guarantee $500 on that order per passenger. And it took, again, some time. There was a deadline, allegedly, by which time this had to be resolved or else. So naturally, it took time to get the money approved. And when the representative came back, apparently still within the timeline, he was nevertheless rejected for being late, and the ship was ordered out of the harbor. But the captain didn't sail back to Europe. He sailed back and forth offshore Miami, while the passengers attempted to get permits for us all to land in the USA, where we were all supposed to go anyway. And the captain allegedly was thinking of beaching the ship. But there was a frigate, U.S. Coast Guard, between the ship and the coast, making sure we did not enter U.S. waters. And so he made plans and even arrangements that when the ship would pass near the southern coast of the U.K., he would crash against some rocks and we'd have to all be disembarked. We were taken by train to Brussels. And the big advantage, one advantage, is that in Belgium we were free, whereas the folks that went to France and Holland were held in a camp, a detention camp for a while. They were free, they could go out of the camp and this, but they were not allowed to live in the community, whereas in Belgium we were able to do that. We landed back in June, so when October came, I started school. I lost the year because of what happened at the Kristallnacht the year before, but now I went to school in Brussels, and therefore I learned French, had to learn French, and learned how to read and write right there. My parents had much more difficulty than I in learning French, so that I was able to serve as a translator for them. And we had a cute an apartment, and we, in essence, just were there waiting for our quota number to come up. At that point, we just had to fill up a couple of suitcases, and get out of there. But we were first arrested because when the Germans attacked Belgium, we were known to be Germans, even though we were stateless. But once that was clarified, we were released. And so after a few days, especially as the Nazis were getting closer, off we went to the station to grab a train. A train was being loaded up with people to go to France, but we couldn't get on it, and it left without us. And everybody left then the station, looking for other ways to get out because that was supposed to be the last train. But apparently there were some wagons still around there and an engine, so they were able to put one more train together. And when we found that out, we managed to get back into the station. So we got on the train, and the train went off to the French border, caught up with the train on the way that had left without us, and luckily we were not on it because it had been strafed. And then Toulouse was the end point. And there, in the meantime, they already had set up refugee centers. So the French were prepared. And they shipped us to a village near Toulouse where we would be, could stay. My father had to report pretty frequently, on demand usually, to the police headquarters because they were constantly checking and harassing. He had to tried to find work. He was not supposed to work. He managed to find work, clandestine work, and to try to bring in a little money. And the only risk I knew was to openly tell anybody that I am Jewish. So I never told anybody I'm Jewish. And so from that time on, for all intents and purposes, life continued, but without the anxieties, except my father now had to seriously get some work. And I was able to switch from the Jewish school, which was not a good school, unfortunately, to the public school. And, there continued throughout until I graduated from high school. And as for me, my own life was fun because I had friends and we were carrying on. So my best friend at that time is still my best friend today. In fact, I will see him next month. And then again, it took forever to get the visa. And when we finally got the visa, the question even was whether or not we should come, because in the meantime, my father's business seemed to be going pretty well. But we didn't have any citizenship. Remember that, the law of 1935. And so for my sake especially, and my future, they decided it was best to come to the United States. So we emigrated, we got here in 1948. It took 10 years from the beginning until the end to get here. So here I am now, age almost 87, 80 years after all of those things happened. Doing the best I can. What happened is the result of hatred. 6 million Jews were killed during the Holocaust only because they were Jews, not because they had done anything bad whatsoever. It's a story that is so awful that we don't want it to be lost simply because the survivors are dying. And the number of survivors is now pretty small. The stories have to be told. They must not be forgotten. And I'm personally happy to see, that efforts are being made to preserve them right now.